Gordon. Long time no see, Gordon. My connection to Gordon has a lot to do with the women in his life. His daughter worked at City TV in the early days, and I think I once made a pass at your ex-wife.
Well, stay away from the present one, Moses. Am I live?
You're live.
I was just delighted to get the invitation to come and visit with you. And then I read the fine print, and I became very concerned because the fine print said, no notes. Very firm. Now, here's why this concerned me, because I learned to speak as a practicing politician. And as a practicing politician, you have to have an opinion on everything. I mean, it's not good enough to say if somebody says, what about the homeless on the streets and the crowding in the emergency room? It's not enough to say, well, I don't know anything about that, but can we talk about MP salaries? That just doesn't work. So you're expected to make speeches constantly on things about which you know virtually nothing, but you have to sound persuasive. And if you do that without notes, you can get into a lot of trouble. Now, some politicians do speak without notes. They're Stockwell Day. Jean Chrétien, when he speaks without notes, fortunately you can't understand him, so he gets into no trouble at all. But you've got to be able to do this. My favorite story in this regard is of a United States senator who was apparently a particularly nasty man. He was probably the same guy that whenever he got a letter he didn't like, he had a form letter to be sent back saying, "Dear Mr. or Ms. Smith, I think you should know that some nut is signing your name to letters to me." This particular senator had a fantastic speechwriter who had made his reputation. And he had come to trust this speechwriter so implicitly that he didn't even look at the speeches in advance. He was, as I say, a man who was unkind to his staff. And the speechwriter obtained another offer of employment far away from the influence of his former boss and wrote his last speech. And the senator was under a great head of steam and doing his usual wonderful job. And at the bottom of the page was made to say, "And I am now going to give you my solution in a non-inflationary way to solve the question of poverty and disease in the third world." And he turned the page, and in big black letters it said, "And now you SOB, you're on your own." So I, like John and Kim, are going to try and talk about the things I know about. But Moses, these are not notes, these are headlines. I want to talk a little bit about my political pilgrimage. I was brought up in a strong liberal family in British Columbia who believed that government, and particularly a liberal government in Ottawa, was the solution to the country's problems. I went to Ottawa to work for a cabinet minister that John Turner worked for as a parliamentary secretary, Arthur Lang, great man, who taught me that politicians could be both honest and electable. And we used to travel all over the country. In a time when we used a lot of propeller aircraft, we traveled 250,000 miles a year, all through the north and the national park systems and the Indian reserves where he later had authority. And accordingly, I got to know just about every liberal association in the country. And as a result of that, I became the second person on the Trudeau leadership team in 1968. And of course, he became prime minister. And I became more and more convinced with this fantastic man that Ottawa did indeed have the answers to everything that counted. And we would tour the country. He was such an interesting man to work for. I'll give you one little anecdote about how fast his mind was. We were in Guelph, great veterinary school. And we were touring a bull semen factory. And there was a huge contingent of press, as usual, following the Prime Minister around. And at the end of the tour of the factory, we went to the boardroom. Now, nobody really cared about bull semen, apart from the jokes that were made. But that day, the Ladane Commission on the Non-Medical Use of Drugs had just reported recommending the decriminalization of marijuana. Now, all the press thought that Trudeau was a secret smoker, so they thought, let's see if we can trap this guy. So the first question, Mr. Prime Minister, do you support the decriminalization of marijuana? So Trudeau looks around the room, and remember, it's a bull semen factory. There's a blackboard at one part of the room, and on the blackboard is nothing except a drawing of Elsie the cow, the client, I suppose. And Trudeau walks over to the blackboard, Prime Minister in favor of decriminalizing marijuana, and draws a balloon out of the cow's mouth and writes, "I like grass." The next question, I haven't read the report. We had a lot of fun. We had a falling out over the Constitution in 1981. I was a strong provincial rightser by then, but I never lost my huge respect for the man. I remember we had a gathering in 1988, the 20th anniversary of the leadership contest, and all the old soldiers were there, and we were telling old war stories. And Trudeau gave up that night and made a remarkable speech, 45 minutes, again without notes because he knew all the subjects so well. And he spoke for 15 minutes on the domestic economy, 15 minutes on federal-provincial relations, and 15 minutes on the world. And then, at the end of all of that, he looked at us and said, you know, we've had, all of us together, a wonderful run in politics. You know, nodded at that. And then he said, and of course, a lot of that was timing. We all nodded at that. And then he said a humble thing that amazed me and made me really think so much more than that. He said, and remember, in timing, everything is luck. It was quite a moment for me. So, my life went on in politics. I went into provincial politics, was elected to the BC legislature. When I went into the caucus, the Liberal caucus there were 5. When I left, there was 1, which was me. I became Liberal leader in 1975 and was elected in 1975, and I was the only one. It was great fun, though, because as a third party, nobody disliked you. You never had any trouble with your caucus. And policy was what you said it was that morning. And then when I was in Victoria, I came to the conclusion that, hey, you know, the big government in Ottawa isn't the answer to everything. The provinces know a lot, too. And then I left government entirely. I ran twice more federally and lost both times and took the advice of a grateful electorate and went into the private sector. And understood more and more there that governments don't know nearly as much as they think they do and maybe try and do too much. So those were good lessons. Now my only association with politics is I'm a political columnist, is one of the hats I wear. The National Post lets me in now and again. Being a political columnist, I have to tell you, is just about the most wonderful job in the world. Moses, you mentioned the most wonderful job in the world yesterday, and maybe that one was, but for me this one is. Because why? Here's what the job is. You sit up there in the bleachers, and you watch these poor politicians down on the floor, and they beat each other with clubs and draw blood, and you watch all this, and then from time to time, at critical intervals, you rush onto the field and you stab the wounded. John was mentioning what happens to politicians when they leave the business, and really it is a very ungrateful business. You hear about the patronage, you hear about those who are appointed senators, but most don't get very much, if anything, and most have their lives disrupted and sometimes ruined by this process. There's a story I know to illustrate just how cataclysmic this ingratitude is. And this is a story of a traveler who sold to farmers. And he was going across the prairies, and it was about dinner time, so the farmer did his business and said, won't you come in and have dinner with the family? Well, that would be great. The traveler got to the table and he saw to his astonishment that at the table was a pig sitting in a chair, and the pig had 3 gold medals. And the traveler said to the farmer, "I've never seen anything like this before." The farmer said, "This is a very special pig." He said, "Now that gold medal, my son was out on thin ice and fell through. And the pig went out on the ice, and my son grabbed his tail and he pulled him out. The second gold medal, my daughter was out in the field, and a bull came at her from behind, and she couldn't see the bull, and the pig squealed, and she realized there was a problem and ran. The third gold medal, my wife got her arm caught in the baler, and the pig grabbed onto her coat and pulled her out." So that's a wonderful story. I said, "Now there's another thing I'm puzzled about, however. I see the pig has a wooden leg. Could you tell me what that's about?" The farmer said, "A fine pig like that, you wouldn't eat it all at once." That's emblematic of the gratitude of politics. I'm now going to refer to my headlines, Moses. I'm now out of all that stuff. I'm at the Fraser Institute. I do 3 things there. I do federalism and unity, I do governance, and I do Aboriginal. The federalism and unity, I'm sorry to say it's hard to get people to pay any attention to these days. I had the opportunity on Monday to have an hour-and-a-half lunch with Bernard Landry, and listening to what he had to say, talking to the various people I see in Quebec, watching the polls in Quebec, I think how far this has gone from our minds and how little we pay attention. And at the same time, how much our media demonize Quebec sovereignist premiers and trivialize Quebec opposition leaders. I won't say anything more about that today except to say that I think it is a question that has not gone away, and we're going to have to think about it in a thoughtful and generous manner. In the matter of governance, John referred to the dollar. Could I have the first slide, please? This is the Canadian dollar in United States terms for the last 30 years. This chart has a lot of personal importance for me because I have been for some years managing partner of a large real estate development in Hawaii. My partners put most of their money in 1976-78 when the dollar was above 90 cents. Their money's been coming out. The last of it's going to come out with $1.63. This is wonderful for them. But for us as Canadians, what has happened over that period is that relative to our largest customer, we have maintained our position by means of cutting our wages year after year after year. Now, some of that, I suspect, is a matter of choice. I was talking to Michael Adams about this briefly after his fine presentation yesterday. To some extent, Canadians say, you know, we want to get along with each other. We're not going to be as competitive and tough as the Americans are, and therefore maybe not as productive. But we're now 30% less productive than the Americans. So that's a lesson about governance. Could I have the second slide, please? These are the only 2 slides I show. This shows the progress of the little country of Ireland, 3.5 million people since 1970, and the progress of Canada. In 1970, the national product of Ireland per person was 40% that of the average Canadian. Today, it's about 20% above that of the average Canadian. That's it for the slides. Thank you. This I take as a lesson in the second hat I wear at the Fraser Institute, which is governance. My argument to you is that we have one of the most primitive political systems in the developed world. We have what is in effect a 4-year elected dictatorship. The powers of our prime minister or premier in the provinces are so extraordinary, and the powers of the ordinary MP, which is the only person that you and I get to vote for, are so minimal that our governance system does not work nearly as well as it should. When you have the Prime Minister who appoints not just all of the justices of the Supreme Court, not just all of the Senate, but the head of the National Police, the head of the military, all of the deputy ministers, signs every bit of legislation, signs every budget bill, and says whether any given MP can take a trip overseas and so on. There's too much power in one person. So that's one side of our problem of governance. The other side is in a parliamentary system, We've spent a lot of time buying off the regions. And I'm convinced that is a part of our lower productivity as well. Incidentally, I'm bouncing very quickly over these two issues. They're all part of a thing I did called the Mel Smith Memorial Lecture, which you can get on www.fraserinstitute.ca. Can anything be done about this? Well, there's a couple of reasons for hope, I think. One reason is that governments are becoming less important in our lives, so the problem matters less. You know, when you have this extraordinary empowerment of the individual through technology, through lower cost travel, communication, transportation, governments are becoming less important all the time, and voluntary exchange, which is that bad word, the free market, is becoming more and more important. So that is changing things by itself. But I want to give another little glimmer of hope, and that's from the West. British Columbia has just elected overwhelmingly a new premier who is specifically, clearly committed to democratic reform. He will very shortly institute, by passing a law, which he can do with no further ado, that the next election in British Columbia will be 4 years hence, on May 17th, I think it is, 2005. We are from now on going to have fixed 4-year elections, which is a major transfer of power away from the First Minister. The intent is to appoint a constituent assembly in British Columbia, appoint or elect, it's not certain yet, which will have as its purpose a revision of our entire provincial constitution, which will then be put to the people in referendum to see how we can make our governance system work better in our province. Just in British Columbia, you say? Interesting bit of history from the United States. Up until 1903, United States senators were appointed by the state legislators. They were not elected. This was put in by the founding fathers, as they were called. There were no mothers, I don't think, I'm not sure, as a way of making sure that state power was in the ascendancy in the national capital. In 1903, the electors of Oregon, through the initiative process they had, passed a law which said that from now on senators had to be directly elected. The idea was so popular that within 9 years, by 1912, an amendment was passed to the United States Constitution applying the system to the entirety of the country. So sometimes good news can spread very quickly. In BC, it's true, we're famous for our political jokes, we've elected many of them, but I am hopeful that this is something really good that will come out of my province. The last thing I want to talk about, and no further jokes, is Aboriginal questions. I am, after 5 years of study, I'm totally satisfied that this is easily the greatest moral political question facing this country. Now, you walk the streets of this great, powerful city, this question's a long ways away. There aren't too many Aboriginals live in Toronto or indeed in Ontario. And the Aboriginal population that is Ontario and East is statistically much better off than the population that's to the West. But there's 800,000 souls out there that are covered by this category, and you probably know the statistics. Probably don't know them in detail, but the suicide rates are multiple those of the ordinary population. The employment data way down, the unemployment data way up, the housing data terrible, the health outcomes, the incarceration rates, the substance abuse. In much of Canada, we're looking at a third world situation, as some of the United Nations countries keep reminding us. I'm not saying this to make anybody feel guilty. There's way too much of that, some of it done by the Aboriginal leaders. Nobody in this room should feel guilty because the taxpayers of this country are collectively putting up $70,000 per family on reserved lands. There's enough money in the system, but it's just not working. And it's time, I think, that there was a major new national focus on this issue. Why isn't it working? Let me give you two very interesting clues. 1867 and 1996. 1867, when Canada was put together, it was a racist, sexist, bigoted world. And it was just normal that women were inferior, Chinese were inferior, Jews, Catholics, and Indians. But only Indians were mentioned in the Constitution. 130 years later, Jews, Catholics, Chinese, women, doing pretty well. Indians are doing terribly. That should tell us something. 1996, 1.1 million Canadians told the census person, yes, I have Aboriginal ancestry. 300,000 of those people said, however, I no longer live like an Aboriginal. I don't have Aboriginal parents, ancestry, I'm proud of that. That's not how I live. The social outcomes, the economic outcomes for this cohort were indistinguishable from those of ordinary Canadians. Same suicide rate, incarceration rate, and so on. Remaining 800,000, roughly half on reserve, roughly half off reserve. The people in the on reserve have the third world average. The people off reserve are somewhere in between. Our governments and what I call the Indian industry have plumped for the solution with the worst outcomes, which is to say, give people incentives to stay on reserves with small collective governments. Now, I'm going to say something which is politically very incorrect, but I believe that all human beings are equal and ought to be treated that way. I think the human genome bears that out. The Indian industry in this country, which is enormous, which includes bureaucrats, Indian elites, lawyers, consultants, that industry depends uniquely on maintaining that Indians are different than other human beings. So I think we're going to have to look at this. I'm not saying anybody should have any problem choosing whatever culture, what way of life they want to have. But if there's one lesson of the 20th century that is unmistakable, it's that the way to freedom and prosperity lies through individual choice and private property. It doesn't run through collective property and big government. I have a friend who's a mayor of a small community in northern Vancouver Island, Jerry Fernie. I was being devil's advocate. I said, Jerry, you're against the Nisga'a Treaty. Why? There's 3,000 people in your community, there's 2,000 people there. What's wrong with a community like that? He said, Gordon, there's nothing I can do to anybody in my community. I can't take a job away from them. I've got 4 employees. I can't take a house away from them. I don't own any houses. I can't not pick up their garbage. It's against the law. There's nothing I can do to these people. But in a community where the government controls the housing and everything else, and all the jobs and so on, we have often seen around this country where the government controls the people rather than vice versa. Now, there are some improvements that are happening. Ottawa is finally moving on this one against a lot of opposition from the industry. British Columbia, my province, has to move on this one because of court decisions which are tangling our economy. We have a new government which I think has enough of a mandate to move on it. But I think we as Canadians have to bring our minds more to something which is too easy to ignore. I'm not asking you to adopt my solution. I'm just asking you to care about it and leave you with what Albert Einstein used to call a thought experiment. I want you to think about 2 Canadian children born today. And one's just an ordinary kid. They grow up with their parents, and their parents socialize them unless there's a problem, in which case the state has to set in, and they go to ordinary schools and charter rights and freedoms and market economy and all that stuff, the normal stuff. The other kid has Indian written on his forehead. And we have set up, by our laws and by our taxpayers' dollars, a special set of laws and financial incentives which lead in a different direction, and where the outcome hasn't been very good in a lot of cases. Now, the moral question I put to you, if it's the parent's choice, that's fine. If parents want to raise their kid as a Hutterite or a Catholic or whatever they want. That's in our system, that's fine. But the moral question to ask is, what right do we, through our laws and our expenditures, as they have worked to this date, I'm not saying we should stop spending money, but as they work to this date, what right have we to make other people's choices for them? So that's, Moses, that's a serious note to end on. I don't want, however, to end in any way on a note of hopelessness, because for the first time in many, many years, I visited Ottawa on this one on Monday, I am seeing genuine stirrings of concern, genuine stirrings of openness and willingness to rethink things through. And my message to you is, say to those people, Godspeed and get it done. Thank you.
Well, I'd vote for Gordon as well. It'd be great if you all ran in one riding. I'd vote for each of you.